So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And I wanted to start with the video because though the pictures are of very mixed quality since I took many of them and I am very low tech, one of the challenges I think in the current moment is to remind people in North America just how diverse the people we call Muslims are. And I think one of the useful ways to do that when I speak in many contexts where there's a great deal less expertise about the Middle East and North Africa than there is in this room is simply to show images. And I will tell some of the stories so you will understand more the significance of some of the images, but I'm happy to talk about any of the others that might have piqued your interest. I'd really like to thank the organizers for including me, thank them for having the book here. This is such an important topic and it's been a very stimulating day so far. And for me, when I think as a human rights lawyer, and I'm sort of a disciplinary outsider here as a human rights lawyer, but as a human rights lawyer, when I think about what is called the Arab Spring and I try to make sense of it, it seems to me to be part of the long struggle to break out of generations of impunity for human rights abuses carried out by a variety of actors. And this is very clear for me on family grounds. And it goes back to my grandfather, who you see here, a peasant leader in Algeria named Magda Bennoune, who was one of the organizers of the May 8th, 1945 revolt against French colonialism that was very brutally suppressed. The exact casualty figures are highly debated, but in any case, my grandfather was killed by the French army during the War of Independence. And then my father, Mahfoud Bennoune, who later became an anthropology professor, was also imprisoned by the colonial authorities during that time. And then later, during the internal conflict in Algeria in the 1990s, which I will talk much more about later on, he was hounded out of teaching at the university by threats from the armed Islamic group, which many other intellectuals received. And during that same time, my cousin, also my grandfather's descendant, my cousin was killed by the armed Islamic group in front of his children. And I think often about this genealogy of impunity. There has been no accounting whatsoever for any of these abuses. And it seems to me, that's on a personal note why I became a human rights lawyer, but I think this struggle for accountability along multiple axes with multiple perpetrators is a critical aspect of what the conference title refers to as the unfinished project of the Arab Spring. And I really think that that's what the first phase of the revolutions of 2011 were really about. They were about saying that people in this region are in the human category just like everyone else. They deserve human rights just like everyone else, economic and social rights, civil and political rights, and really about challenging this sort of genealogy of impunity for abuses. And what the activists did in 2011, and here you see one of the young law students in Egypt who was killed during that time, what the activists did in 2011 was incredibly brave. They said just because we and our parents and our grandparents have lived with injustice doesn't mean we have to keep on living with it. And they risked imprisonment, torture, police violence, and of course death in the streets to stand up. And I think we have to remember that. That has to be the starting point. But then, of course, we know the tragic follow-up to that, that instead of the dignity they sacrificed for, we are now seeing new generations of abuse, both by autocratic governments and by Islamists in and out of power, who offer a sort of even worse form of autocracy, theocracy. And people can expect only the remotest possibility of accountability, and that's in the best case scenario, probably no accountability whatsoever. And I think another thing that's really critical to remember, one of the things I really dislike is the tabula rasa theory of what we call the Arab Spring, the idea that this suddenly happened. This, in fact, built on generations of protest movements. Here you see in Algeria the protest movement against the unjust family code back in, I believe that's in the 80s. And so really what happened then was building on that protest tradition that was trying to claim accountability. And that brings me to the title of my lecture. Sorry, now I'm going in the wrong direction. the title of my lecture today, which, as Yasmin said, is The Struggle Against Fundamentalism After the Revolutions of 2011. Your fatwa still does not apply here. And let me just explain the title from my book, in case you're wondering. It actually comes from a Pakistani play. In the book, I look far beyond North Africa, but it's a play by Shahid Nadim, whose wife Madia Gauhar, the theater director you see here, about Bulleh Shah, the 18th century Sufi mystic in Pakistan who was struggling against the fundamentalists of his day. So it's really about sort of a tradition of resistance. And so for this project, I interviewed about 300 people of Muslim heritage from nearly 30 countries, from Afghanistan to Mali, and right across North Africa, from Egypt to Tunisia to Algeria, a little bit in Libya. I wish I could have done much more. And I did that specifically to learn about their opposition to fundamentalism, how they analyzed the problem, the strategies that they were using, the kinds of actions that they were engaging in, because it seemed to me critical that international lawyers try to actually listen to what people on the ground have to say about the challenges that they are facing to their human rights and the way in which the international community ought to respond. We really don't do enough listening, either in academia or in policy circles. And it seemed to me critical, there you see the recorder, to go around and talk to as many people as I could. I also did this because of real frustration over the way that my father and his fellow activists in Algeria in the 1990s who spoke out against the rise of fundamentalism then, the way in which they were not listened to by the international community, the way in which they were ignored, no matter how much they risked their lives to stand up to the violence that was engulfing their country. And here you see women activists doing that. And one of my sources of frustration in the way that the so-called Arab Spring has been talked about in the media, in academia, on the left, is how little we often listen to North Africans, and I'm going to talk specifically about North Africa here, and especially how little we listen to what North African women have to say, notwithstanding their very active roles as participants in all of these processes. So, a big part of this project was about trying to hand people the microphone and learn from them. And what I found is that the current news from the region is really horrific, despite the hope of 2011. But it's not surprising because of things that women activists were saying to me, and I'm sure to many of you, since 2011. Based on what I heard across North Africa, it became clear very early on after 2011 that one of the most important human rights struggles in the region was going to be the one waged against fundamentalism in the wake of the thing we call the Arab Spring. Now, there are many other human rights struggles in the region that are critical. The battle against for economic justice, the battle against either counter-revolution by past autocrats or ongoing autocracy and militarism. But I think this particular human rights struggle in this moment is especially defining in North Africa, especially for women. And it's not clear to me, why there wasn't more of a realization of this, particularly in fields where people were talking about democratization and law reform in my field since the very beginning, since 2011. In terms of exceptionalism and fighting off the sort of charge of exceptionalism here, I think it's interesting to note, of course, that this is part of a broader global challenge posed by what some call religious extremism. And I think about an excellent book in my field written by Hilary Charlesworth and Christine Chinkin, who are leading feminist international lawyers, called The Boundaries of International Law. And they argued, this goes back to the year 2000, that religious extremism, as they termed it, was one of the two biggest threats to women's human rights worldwide. So this is part of a global challenge. It is not just a problem in North Africa or for Muslims, though I think we have to be honest and say that it is a particularly severe problem in these contexts at the moment, in the difficult transitions brought on by the revolutions of 2011. And we have to find a principled and thoughtful way, I think, as academics to respond to that challenge in support of those on the front lines. I want to be very clear about how I view the gravity of this problem, and I have to confess with great respect that I did feel somewhat last evening, that this was downplayed in the opening keynote and reduced to, I think the reference was 15 decapitations. In fact, in my view, we are facing the rise of genocidal, many in the region call them fascist movements. I talked to Gibran Nasser, a young Pakistani activist from Karachi, who's talking about genocide against Shia in Pakistan and beyond, where he is an activist. We're clearly seeing genocide aimed at Yazidis. We're seeing a tidal wave of violence and racism against religious minorities across the region, across North Africa, but also against Muslims who think differently than extremists, which is many, many, many Muslims, most in many contexts. And here you see Samira and Naimi, just one of the many people executed by ISIS after speaking out against their destruction of cultural heritage sites in her home city of Mosul. We are witnessing movements that are not only practicing systematic rape in armed conflict, which is common, again, in many regions of the world, unfortunately, but they're doing something very particular. They are openly justifying it. They are publicizing the fact that they are doing it, and they are issuing what they claim to be a theological justification for it. This is a relatively particular phenomenon, and I think it is something that we have to confront. While it certainly is part of a global pattern of sexual violence in armed conflict that goes beyond this particular form. So in my view, right now, we are seeing fundamentalist movements and armed fundamentalist movements in particular posing one of the greatest challenges to human rights, perhaps arguably in the world, but certainly in the region. This is a massive crisis, and it has both endogenous and exogenous, internal and external causes, which I think cannot simply be laid at the door of the foreign policy of one powerful country. I think the problem, alas, is much more complicated than that. And I think in the audience last night, someone asked a very important question, which is, how do we have a multi-directional critique which looks both at the failures of the international community and powerful actors globally and regionally, but also at failures and problems closer to home in our own communities to confront these challenges? And my view, my friends, is that if we do not answer that vital question, hundreds of thousands will die across the region, and we will be leaving the activists who have the courage to stand up on the front lines alone. And I really hope that won't occur. Just to lighten things up a little bit for a moment, just a bit of gallows humor. Back in February of 2011, just before the fall of Mubarak, my book was about to come out here, and my editor at Norton worried that suddenly the book had become irrelevant because the Arab Spring, which was, as we all know, not led by Islamists or even much supported by them in most contexts, seemed to her to have rendered the topic moot because Islamism was now irrelevant. Remember that moment, 5 minutes in February of 2011? And I was so excited. Maybe my book is obsolete. This is wonderful. I can write about something else. I actually wanted to write about what we were calling the Mediterranean boat people before it became a big issue. But of course, unfortunately, the sort of terrible punchline is that my editor had nothing to worry about. And I was completely disappointed, as were so many others, and the struggles of people in this region, people of Muslim heritage generally, but in North Africa specifically against fundamentalism, have, in my view, never been so relevant. Now, I've been using this term, Muslim fundamentalism. Let me just, I don't have to, I know, explain this to most people, but just let me be clear about how I understand the terminology. I cite in the book a definition given by the Algerian sociologist Mariameh Elie-Lucas, who founded a wonderful organization called the Network of Women Living Under Muslim Laws, which is a transnational network of women's human rights defenders, both in Muslim majority contexts and also in minority and diaspora situations as well. And she says that fundamentalisms are political movements of the extreme right, which in a context of globalization manipulate religion in order to achieve their political aims. And I know we can have a lot of discussion about, is it religious, is it political? But I do think when I look at these movements, qua movements, the political piece is key. It is what Saadia Abbas, the Pakistani post-colonial theorist, has called the radical politicization of theology, though it certainly has a religious component one can think of as well. But for me, these are political movements that need to be confronted and responded to politically. Now, for the most part in this audience, I don't have to go through this slide. How do Muslim fundamentalists, or fundamentalists generally, but in Muslim majority context at the moment, violate human rights? The widespread attacks on civilians, I think everybody knows about that now, although unfortunately we pay much less attention to the mass casualty attacks that simply happen almost every day in places like Iraq and Afghanistan and Nigeria, and that's just wrong. But that violence is only part of the problem. We also see that these movements, whether they openly espouse violence or not, are advocating discrimination against religious minorities, advocating discrimination against minorities within and without Islam, discrimination against LGBT people, advocacy of corporal punishments like flogging and stoning. And I think this one is critical to understand because the fundamentalists, and especially their sort of soft-spoken representatives in the West, often speak in the language of freedom of religion. In fact, what they're about is curtailing the freedom of religion of everyone else who either chooses to practice in a different way or chooses not to practice. And then the most defining thing there at the bottom is the all-out war on the rights of women. And so, these are some of the aspects that I think make these movements such a threat to human rights in the region at the moment. But what I'd like to do, just for a minute, and this is really kind of responding to what was said on the first panel about talking about agency and thinking about the activists on the ground, is to rewind for a minute, to go back to 2011 and just share a few excerpts from some of the interviews that I did at that time that are in the chapter of the book called Sidi Bouzid, Blues and the Green Wave, Journeys Through the Arab Spring and Fall. And that chapter is based on interviews that I conducted in North Africa with women's human rights defenders in February and March of 2011, and then again follow-ups in 2012 and later on. It was a very, very difficult chapter to write because things just kept changing. But I think, to understand where we are now on these issues, it's very useful to go back and look at what was happening in 2011 and the way that women's human rights defenders were thinking about it from the very beginning. Here you see actually a picture from the attempt to get protests going in February of 2011 in Algiers, and those didn't take off. And of course, there's a debate among Algerians, was it a bad thing the Arab Spring passed us by, or was it the best thing that ever happened when people look around? But here was the attempt by protesters, women at the heart of it, just before they got scraped off the sidewalk, actually by police women, which was a very interesting moment to witness. In any case, if you cast your mind back to 2011, let me just explain for people maybe who don't work on North Africa, the chapter title, Sidi Bouzid Blues. Sidi Bouzid is, of course, the hardscrabble town of about 40,000 people in central Tunisia, where Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire back in December of 2010, sparking the revolts which led to the fall of Ben Ali. And one thing I think it's also critical to remember is he was one of many, many people self-immolating. Self-immolation was happening actually across the region, and it had been happening in Algeria very widely and went on after that time as well. So that explains Sidi Bouzid. The Green Wave, I should mention, because this is a little confusing, I think, sometimes to people who work on Iran. In North Africa, the Green Wave is used to refer to the rise of fundamentalist movements in the wake of 2011, green being associated with Islamist parties in the region. And a final terminological aside before I get to the stories and the interviews, I want to acknowledge that many on the ground see the term Arab Spring as problematic, even though I am using it. I use it in the book. The conference title uses it. In fact, as we know, mostly in the region, these events were simply called a Thawra, the revolution, but then some question whether that's the appropriate term, whether they were revolutions or not. And of course, both of the terms, Arab and Spring, have challenges associated with them. And we have to remember that in North Africa, not everyone who was involved was an Arab. Many in Libya, Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco were Amazigh speaking or Berber speaking. In Egypt, there were Nuba people and so on, and they too were fighting for inclusive democracy. And as to the spring part, its positive connotations and its seasonal sort of association have also been questioned. I asked a Lebanese activist, Lina Abu Habib, what the biggest challenges in the region are in the post-Arab Spring, and she said to me, well, the biggest challenge is to stop calling it the Arab Spring. None of us have done that, but nonetheless, I do think it's important to remember that the terminology itself is problematized. A Tunisian lawyer said to me, stop calling it a spring. The Arab Spring is depicted as a miracle. In reality, it's becoming more and more of a curse, the curse of Islamism. Now, you get very different views about this if you talk to different people, but that's just to convey some of the questioning about this terminology on the ground. I'm going to use it, just think of it as being in quotation marks. So without further ado, let's just cast our mind back to a few stories from 2011. So this is Sidi Bouzid Blues. And not right here, but near here, I was standing in the spot where Mohamed Bouazizi had actually set himself on fire and unknowingly sparked what later came to be the Arab Spring. It's a very emotional place to stand. You think about all the pressures and all the disappointment faced by young people of modest means across the region that sometimes turns their thoughts to paradise. And all of that pressure and all that disappointment really infused the air in this particular place with a longing to truly live and to matter. I burn, therefore I am. That was the headline in an Algerian newspaper explaining why increasing numbers of North Africans were self-immolating around the time of Bouazizi's death. I wanted them to see me die, one woman was quoted as saying. Those whose misery is normalized know that they are only visible when they burn, though just for one awful moment. But on that March 2011 day, when I visited Sidi Bouzid, unemployed university graduates just like Bouazizi were on hunger strike. Here you see them in a makeshift tent near the spot where he had ended it all and started it all. And I was barraged with explanations for their fast. But what I'll never forget is that no one talked about Allah or about being Muslim. They talked about being Tunisian. They wanted bread, honor, and dignity. And other than the ability to stay there in that tent in the public square and express their grievances, which was admittedly a very significant advance in Tunisia, these young denizens of Sidi Bouzid had seen no material benefits from the revolution yet. And I bet if I went back to Sidi Bouzid now, the same thing, unfortunately, would be true. And I'll never forget a 22-year-old named Hussein, you see him right there in the middle with the sugar cube, who looked at me and said, I am ready to die. So I remember thinking, will governments in North Africa save the next generation of would-be Bouazizis? That was the key question. They clearly haven't, and many of those would-be Bouazizis, female and male, are the people that we now see fleeing to Europe. So these problems are all related. But thinking back to that moment, that time in North Africa in 2011, the question really was what the future was going to be. Clearly, forcing Ben Ali to dégage or to get out, as Tunisians said, is all to the good, or was all to the good. But the future of Tunisia was highly uncertain at that point, and I think it remains that way today. Having escaped a relatively secular autocracy, were they doomed to theocracy, or could they break out of the so-called Islamist dilemma, a very problematic view which offers these as the only available alternatives? That is perhaps the central question across North Africa at that time and now, how to break out of that dilemma and create and live and realize other options. That was the question I was seeking answers for in 2011, which was really a season like no other. Sorry, so again, my photography skills, I think I'll just advance to the next picture there. You see this is a Congress held by the Tunisian Democratic Women's Association for Equality and Citizenship back in March of 2011, and about 1,000 women gathered. It was very unprecedented, of course, in Ben Ali's Tunisia to be able to have this kind of very open forum and discuss political issues in such a critical way. And they were talking about advancing women's rights in revolutionary Tunisia. That was the paradigm in that moment, March 2011. How do we use this moment to go forward? I don't think people ever thought how much of a rearguard action they were going to have to fight to keep from going backward. But I remember even then a woman in the audience, an activist in the revolution, got up and wept as she took the floor over having been recently threatened by fundamentalist youth in the Kasbah after the fall of Ben Ali. They said they were going to create an Islamic state, and she said that was not what she had revolted for. Maybe in Saudi Arabia, she said, but not here. And at that point, something very interesting happened, which was an Algerian woman went to the microphone and urged Tunisians to learn from what had happened in her country in the late 1980s, when there was suddenly a democratic opening. As she reminded them, unfortunately, given the lack of political preparation of the opposition because of single-party rule, Islamism was what grew most rapidly in the petri dish of sudden democratization. They must, she urged them, organize themselves very quickly against such an outcome. And what I remember was that at that time, everyone said, "We're not like you Algerians." And the amazing thing is, when I have gone back to Tunisia since then, it is precisely the opposite thing that people are now saying. Maybe we're more like Algeria than we thought. I mean, the two countries are different, but the point is that the risks are there across the region. Now, at that time in 2011, everyone agreed there should be no going backward. And I think in Tunisia, people really understood that their country was one of the most advanced on women's rights in the region. Indeed, among Muslim-majority societies generally, they had the relatively progressive family law inherited from the Bourguiba era. They had access to abortion. 31% of lawyers and 27% of judges were female. And so I think this was another critical thing that was not greatly understood in the Western media coverage. There was this kind of tabula rasa theory of the Arab world, as if everything was terrible and people only had something to gain. In fact, they also had a great deal to lose. And it's that complex reality of both needing to move forward in certain areas, but also having made some gains that you have to protect. It was that very complex reality that everyone confronted, but no one confronted it as much as the women's human rights defenders did. And I think those women knew in 2011, and they know now, it was just in Tunis in August, they know now that if their country, which is one of the most secular, socially liberal, Arab Muslim majority countries, if it were to fall to fundamentalist rule, it would be a huge symbolic loss for the region. And they knew that. They were talking about this back in the spring of 2011. I don't have a picture of the next person, so I'm going to use this nice architectural theme from Kairouan. So on my last spring day in Tunis back in March of 2011, I interviewed a woman lawyer named Alia Shamari, who had been a human rights lawyer under the Ben Ali regime. And her husband, Khameis, had spent a great deal of time in prison during Ben Ali, but he had then, in the post-revolution, become the Tunisian ambassador to UNESCO. It was this kind of amazing moment where you could go from being a political prisoner to being an ambassador. He is actually now a member of the Tunisian National Institution for Transitional Justice, which was established by the January 2014 Constitution, one of the few hopeful things in the region, and I think one has to point those out as well. But I remember that moment in 2011, the air really shimmered around Alia Shamari, shimmered with possibility. She said, "We didn't think we would live to see this extraordinary moment." She said, "We could be the first state in the global south with a Muslim majority population to install a real democracy based on equality between men and women, based on judicial, economic, and social justice." And I remember thinking, Carthaginian utopia. In that moment, it really did seem attainable. But Alia Shamari was not at all naive. She was euphoric, but she was not naive. She was not in denial, like many others in and out of North Africa, about the dangers that were lying ahead for her country. She recognized what she called the possibility of the confiscation of this revolution by the most retrograde elements of political Islam. Wahhabism exists in Tunisia. Now that's shocking to people, I think, sometimes when you say that, Tunisia, but Wahhabism exists in Tunisia, she said. Salafists also, and I know that in this moment their objective is to destroy the republic and to install a caliphate. And she did not spare the Ennahda party either, Tunisia's largest Islamist political grouping, which is regularly dubbed moderate in the Western press and by Western academics. Alia, on the other hand, said, look, democracy is in danger with these people, and the rights of women also. And they use a strategic discourse to make us believe they have become moderate. But then she gave me the example of what had just happened on International Women's Day 2011. The women's rights activists, just as I said, were intent on moving forward on that International Women's Day, March 8th, 2011. They were calling for equality in inheritance and for the freedom of Tunisian women, Muslim women, to marry non-Muslim men. And Ennahda came out very clearly against each and every one of these demands. And for her, she said that is the real face of Ennahda. So I asked her in that moment what strategies Tunisian feminists should employ in the face of all of this, and she highlighted the one that I heard again and again from women's human rights defenders in that time, and that was separation of religion and law. Not a trendy thing to say in North America at all, but that's what I was hearing again and again. Separation of religion and law. And I said to Alia, is there any way in this political moment in Nahda, the fundamentalists, are going to accept a secular constitution? Is that realistic? And she said, no, they will scream atheism. They will say that we are heretics. But what was interesting is it absolutely didn't dissuade her from continuing to make this claim and to make it very vocally and publicly, because she believed that a secular constitution was the best way to guarantee human rights in her country, and she was willing to demand it. And it was this kind of same refusal to kowtow to realism, so-called, that made her and her husband oppose Ben Ali all those years when they could have had a comfortable middle-class life. But back in 2011, Alia Shamari was suggesting that there had to be a clear strategy, and I think this is still relevant, a clear strategy to communicate that a separation of religion and state is the only way, in fact, to guarantee everyone's freedom of religion. Alia is a human rights lawyer. She doesn't want political parties banned. She doesn't want people silenced. What she wanted was to see the fundamentalists countered by a progressive strategy of engaging youth and working on the ground in communities. And I heard this again and again. All too often, people are sort of painted with the broad brush that if you take these positions, you must be trying to sort of repress the Islamists. This is not what I was hearing from these activists. What they were trying to figure out how to do was how to out-organize movements that have so many more resources, financial, international support, and sort of the weight of deploying religious terminology. They have so many more resources than these activists do, but nevertheless, that's what they were trying to figure out. And I always remember something Alia Shamari said to me. She said she acknowledged that Islam is our heritage, but she said she also rejects what she called all that is oppressive in Islam and in Islamic law, which is not of divine heritage. Very courageous thing to say. She reminded me then, and I think this remains very important, that it is everyone's right to question aspects of their own heritage, including in the Arab region. It is everyone's right to try to take into the future that which is liberating and leave in the past that which is not. And it's, in fact, the only way that humanity has ever advanced in this region or anywhere else. And I'll also never forget what Alia said when I'm leaving. She was acutely aware of the closing window of the revolutionary moment, and she was desperate for progressive forces to get unified. She said, "We are living in a state of grace. This will end soon." I mean, I think people were becoming increasingly aware of this. And the very last thing she said to me was, "We need to try to save democracy." And I think that is precisely a big piece of what has been going on since then. In Egypt, one of the many people I interviewed was a veteran women's rights activist named Fatma Kafagi. And she told me that during the Mubarak era, she had founded the Gender Ombudsperson's Office, but then had had to battle Suzanne Mubarak to try to make it work for women. And when she realized that autocracy rendered the mechanism useful, she resigned, which was no easy feat with Mrs. Mubarak involved. She was then there was an attempt to prosecute her for leaving over all sorts of allegations. And so she was sort of a natural fit for taking up the revolutionary cause. She had tangled with the regime herself in a very direct, personal way. And at the time when I met her in the spring of 2011, she was working with groups that combat religious discrimination and were seeking to document the government's abuses during the revolution, such as the killing of the law student and the others, the law student I showed the pictures of. And like Alia Shamari, she said to me about the overthrow of Mubarak, "I never believed it was going to happen in my lifetime. I was thrilled." She said, I had paid the price for expressing my opposition to the regime, and I got very depressed. And I heard this theme again and again about political depression. Algerians knew all about this from the 1990s, and one of the great things about 2011 was that antidote of political hope was suddenly sort of on offer. And I think it's been a very sad thing to see the reversal of that since 2011. I think we're seeing people trying to hang on to some of the shards of that political hope. Now, back in March of 2011, when I met Fatma in Cairo, she had warned me even then about the increasing strength of the Salafists, who would surprise much of the Western media with their success at the polls in November. But on the ground, she was telling me back in March of 2011, the Salafists were already working to shift the cultural consensus and to curtail decades-long efforts by women's rights advocates like Fatma. She said, for her, the Salafists are like the Taliban. They insist that women have to go back to their houses and should not go to school. And she was outraged that women who work on the education of girls and stopping female genital mutilation could not implement their projects in many rural areas anymore because the Salafists were telling the families that they worked with that education is haram, shameful, forbidden. So there was all this pushback on efforts to stem FGM, on all sorts of violations of women's rights and moves for women's equality. The FGM issue, of course, huge in Egypt, where an estimated 96% of ever married women have been subjected to the practice. There were reports that the Muslim Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party at about that time organized mobile medical convoys. Last night we heard about their clinics. This was a little bit different. They organized mobile medical convoys that, among other things, promoted and practiced FGM in rural areas in violation of Egyptian law. And this sparked complaints from villagers south of Cairo and from Egyptian human rights groups. Fatma was already worried about these developments back in 2011. And she told me a story about what started happening in Tahrir Square, the way that Tahrir Square was changing, as we all know, and the many terrible things that would happen there. Here's one of the young activists, Doa Qasim, who was there on the day that Fatma told me about. And this is also a story from March 8th of 2011. That was a critical moment. International Women's Day 2011. I think it was a moment when many women across the region realized, just as Algerians and others had realized before them, the fact that we participated equally in these revolutions, it did not guarantee either the advancement of our rights or even the maintenance of the status quo on our rights afterwards. So on International Women's Day, March 8th, 2011, in Tahrir Square, there was an attempt to have 1 million women march, which didn't work out very well. There were not that many women who showed up, but there was a huge counter-demonstration of Salafists in particular. And Fatma said that the absolute worst chant was, "Women no, FGM yes." And it was very shocking to many of these women activists to return to Tahrir Square and to find the way that the discourse, the slogans had changed so abruptly. And Fatma really said that for her, what happened in Tahrir Square that day was the kickoff of a male supremacist counter-revolution. And here is another one of the wonderful women activists working against that, Dr. Magda El Adly, who's also one of the leading campaigners against torture in Egypt, torture of anyone. So this then brings us to what is often called, if you go to these conferences, the Arab Autumn, and I apologize for the seasonal metaphors, but everyone seems to use them. So by the fall of 2011, the memories of spring were beginning to fade, and Kafka was beginning to stalk North Africa. In Tunisia, a prominent Ennahda woman deputy, which was by then the ruling Islamist party, was denouncing single mothers, saying they needed to be taught morality and were not suitable for our religion. An Ennahda spokesman named Samir Dilou, who defended polygamy as a constitutional right, became Tunisia's first human rights minister, and he went on in that position to deplore homosexuality as a perversion that requires medical treatment. Now, of course, he was not alone in the region in holding such views across the political spectrum, unfortunately. But given that the bellwether revolution of the Arab world had produced this first human rights ministry, it was a very worrying development that this was the sort of person who filled the post. Meanwhile, on the streets, Salafists were beginning to, and here you see protesters against terrorism. On the streets, Salafists were beginning to attack non-veiled women, hurling the slogan of the revolution against them now, telling them to dégage, or get out, as had been said to Ben Ali before. And emboldened by the laissez-faire approach of Ennahda, these Salafists besieged the Manouba University campus, which you see here on the outskirts of Tunis, trying to introduce the niqab and shutting down classes and exams, threatening teachers and the dean. And the Ennahda government sat by and watched this. There were even reports that prominent Nahda members came and participated in the Salafist sit-in at times. And I interviewed Amel Grami. Some of you may know her work. I'll come back and explain that slide. This is Amel Grami, who's an intellectual historian. And she says that color is a form of resistance, by the way. She's an intellectual historian, expert on Islam, and one of Manuba's professors who stood up to the Salafists on her campus, which they had dubbed Manubistan. And I recommend the book, Manubistan, published inside Tunisia, about these events. At one point, Amel was actually physically assaulted by some of the Salafist protesters, and actually, you can imagine this, there are a lot of academics in the room, picked up and thrown physically off her own campus. And she said to me, I spent my life teaching values and promoting interfaith dialogue, and my whole project is about differences and the right to be different. And finally, I found myself the other. So this reminded me of what Alia Shamari had said to me back in 2011. This is something she said to me at about that same time, in the fall of 2011. I finished interviewing her, and that always is when people say the most interesting things. I had turned off the recorder, and Alia looked at me and she said, you do know I was a human rights lawyer during the Ben Ali regime, and I defended many Nahda political prisoners. And she said, now I ask them if they will defend me. And when I said this once in a conference, it was a very prominent, wonderful Jordanian human rights lawyer, Asma Khader, who was in the audience. And so I said this question, now I ask, will they defend me? And Asma shouted out, they will not. I mean, there's a very strong feeling about this. It's actually been one of the tragic things that a number of those who were the people to defend the human rights of Islamists when they were being oppressed, Shukri Belaid, another prominent example of this, the Tunisian human rights lawyer who defended Salafists during the Ben Ali regime and then was later assassinated by them in February of 2013, a real tragedy. Now, people didn't give up in spite of this. People have kept going. I don't think we have the right to be pessimistic. They're trying not to be. And I did a follow-up interview with an Egyptian woman activist named Doa Abdelal at the end of 2011, and I remember she sounded very weary but absolutely resolute. And she said, everyone has realized there is no way back. We have to go on. And she sighed as she considered the landscape. She said, sometimes you cannot imagine that these are the choices. She was looking at the Muslim Brotherhood and the military. All this work, these are the choices. And she said something that, again, I think is critical. We have to create more choices. We can't pretend they already exist, but we have to create more choices, and I think that's absolutely critical, and that's part of what civil society is trying to do. But I think it's clear there needs to be a more and more organized political strategy for doing just that. So I was thinking about this landscape that she was deciding, that we have to create more choices. And it reminded me of when she's sort of decrying the Muslim Brotherhood on the one side and the army on the other. And I'll explain the cartoon in a second. But it reminded me of the work of an Algerian satirist. And actually, satire is a very big thing in North Africa. Cartoons, you see an example here and so on. But there's a wonderful Algerian satirist called Shoki Ahmadi. And he wrote this beautiful opinion piece at about that time, explaining what he called the convergence between head-shrinking autocratic Arab nationalism and fascist-type Islamism. And he asked, what are their common points? He said, well, contempt for the individual and an aversion to collective and individual freedoms. And what I think is really remarkable about so many of the activists on the ground, the women's human rights defenders, is that they're refusing to choose either the head-shrinking autocrats or the fascist-type Islamists. And here you have, this is just another example of satire from Algeria for anybody who doesn't read French. I tried to also put in a political cartoon by this wonderful cartoonist Slim of a policeman so that we'd have the head-shrinking autocrats and the Islamists here both, but I, for technical reasons, couldn't get the other one. But here is, this cartoon says, when I think that our mothers are women, I blush. So there's a lot of satire of this, and just horror. These are the choices. We open up political space, and this is what rushes in. But back in 2011, at the end of the year, tired, depressed, worried, frustrated with the choices, Doa Abdallah said that at that point she was still hoping that the fundamentalists would be constrained by what she called the realities of politics and the needs of Egyptians. She said the whole infrastructure of the society is really shaking, and some of the small, faraway governorates and villages are really poor. They need to come up with real political solutions, not about covering women's heads. And then she said something great, which I think should be on t-shirts. She said, "I don't think that reciting Quran over a broken pipe will fix it." And I think that's very important. Saying Islam is the solution is a nice slogan, but it doesn't really offer a platform for fixing those broken pipes. So as we know then, by the summer of 2013, in both Egypt and Tunisia, many ordinary people had had enough of their new fundamentalist rulers, and they began to revolt again. Activists recognized that there would be, in fact, no accountability for past abuses, but rather a new generation of abuses with no recourse. As the Tunisian journalist Olfa Riahi said of Ennahda, "I realized they were not revolutionaries. The system would remain the same, except now they would command it. I came to understand that my revolution and theirs were not the same. They practice democracy only once, and that is to take power. Once in power, they forget entirely about democracy." Moreover, the key issues of social and economic justice, which motivated the revolts and were of great concern to Riahi, were not being championed by fundamentalists in power, who were calling strikers apostates and focusing instead on morality issues. And of course, we see that strategy with the Christian right in the US as well. And so by 2012, the leading Tunisian legal scholar, a man named Yed Ben Ashur, was warning that we risk finding ourselves in a short time in a worse dictatorship than that of Ben Ali, a theocratic dictatorship. And in 2013, then, Tunisia experienced its first political assassinations of those who had opposed fundamentalists, including, as I mentioned already, the outspoken lawyer Shukri Belaid, but also the Constituent Assembly delegate Mohamed Brahmi, who you see here. And Mohamed Brahmi was a very religious man. In fact, he was Hajj Mohamed Brahmi. And as his widow said, he was Muslim in his home and in his heart, not in his political party. I was thinking during the talk last night, actually, of some of the things that Mohamed Brahmi said. He said that for him, the Muslim Brotherhood, in a way, was the completion of the colonial project, that they managed to try to break North African societies in a way that colonialism had not succeeded in doing. And he would say these things very openly in the Constituent Assembly. And he denounced a lot of the funding that came in from Qatar and the Gulf to support the fundamentalist parties in the 2011 elections. And he was assassinated in 2013. And that was a huge spark in Tunisia for protests, which then led to finally a transitional process, ultimately a technocratic government, and the situation as we see it now. Of course, we know what happened in Egypt, and I don't have a lot of time to go into detail about that, but I think it is more well known in any case than what happened in Tunisia. And I think what these movements in 2013 that looked a lot like the movements in 2011 were trying to do, what they were trying to do was to get the 2011 revolutions back on track as they saw it. With those activists, many of them, not all of them, but many of them, as Amari had put it, wanting neither head-shrinking autocrats nor fascist-type Islamists, though because they have not been able, for the most part, to really offer a unified, organized political alternative, they may yet end up with one or the other. And it, in fact, looks that way, certainly in Egypt. In Tunisia, it's less clear what will happen. Will there be a return of Ennahda? Will there be a return of political repression from the security forces, which we're beginning to see in the fight against terrorism? So what do we do with all of this? You know, where are we now? Well, I think in the current context, one of the only ways to understand what is happening is to listen to the voices on the ground. Of course, there are many different ones who will tell you many different things. But I'm particularly interested in the voices of women's human rights defenders. I didn't say women as a bigger category, but specifically women's human rights defenders, because internationally almost no one is listening to them, and because their social project is the opposite of the social project of the fundamentalists that we hear much more about. And what is interesting about the women's human rights defenders is that many of them are arguing arguing that they reject both of the forms of patriarchy on offer across the region. That is, authoritarian, ostensibly non-Islamist states and armed forces, and Islamism. And again, the challenge is to build other viable, concrete, truly democratic alternatives. So when we think about the situation today, in 2015, jumping rapidly forward and skipping many, many important points, and I apologize for that. When we look at the situation in 2015, one thing that I have been hearing from women activists again is how concerned they are, in particular, about the issue of security. Jihadist terrorism has now become a threat to the entire region, from Tripoli to Tunis, from Ain Dafla to Sheikh Zouaid. The northern Sinai alone has seen hundreds killed, hundreds wounded, both among the security forces, among members of armed groups, but also civilians. We are seeing Christian Egyptians beheaded on Libyan beaches. We're seeing young Algerian conscripts mowed down on the Eid. We're seeing Libyan women's rights advocates murdered in their homes and in their cars. And the beaches of Sousse, as we know, witnessing the slaughter of tourists, not only leading to a real tragedy in the immediate sense, but devastating the tourist economy of Tunisia. And in fact, when I was in Tunisia recently for the Congress of Intellectuals Against Terrorism, the dean of Manouba University said to me, Tunisia is at war with an invisible enemy. But many people in North Africa, women's rights activists, intellectuals, and others have been warning of these dangers for many years. And the question is, has the world been listening to them? Since about President Obama's speech in 2014 to the General Assembly, where he talked about ISIS in particular and called on Muslims to stand up against extremism, I think there's been this idea that the West has figured out that this is a problem and needs Muslims to join them in opposing it. And in fact, I think we have to shift our paradigm around. Precisely the opposite is true. It is people on the ground in Muslim majority contexts who recognize the danger posed by these movements long before, when the West in particular was flirting with them, warned the international community, and there was absolutely no response. And so many of those people have, and there's Dean Kazdagli, and so many of those people have been killed and threatened. And I think the real challenge is now, how do we find ways internationally to support those people, or at the very least, to make sure that they are being heard? And I think that's absolutely critical. Now, I asked Sharifa Kadar, and you see Sharifa here, who is the president of Jazairuna, which is the Algerian Association of Victims of Islamist Terrorism. I asked her what her reaction was to President Obama's 2014 call for a global struggle against fundamentalist thought. And she has worked on this issue for about 20 years. And she said, look, we already had our own Islamic State in Algeria, and we spoke out, but when we did back in the 90s, no one was listening to us. So she said, I'm all for this, but you have to understand we've been doing this for a long time, and I want to see who is actually going to stand with us. And this is one of the tragic things that I found again and again, that the people doing this work on the front lines are not receiving support. They're not invited to speak. Their work is not translated internationally. They're not very well known. They don't end up on CNN. And that absolutely has to change. And I really remember this viscerally from Algeria in the 1990s. And there is even sometimes a sort of a willful failure to understand what exactly is at risk in these societies. And I think about the way in which what happened in Algeria is misrepresented and misunderstood. And I just wanted to say two words about that, perhaps in response to the way that it was characterized last night. The suggestion was made that France had called for the interruption of the elections. In fact, what actually happened, many Algerians believe that the Socialist Party in France was pretty friendly with the Islamic Salvation Front. The people who were calling for the interruption of the electoral process were civil society and trade unionists. There were about 300,000 people on the streets of Algiers calling for that. And why were they doing that? Is it because they didn't believe in democracy? No, it's because the Islamic Salvation Front was openly campaigning inside the country, saying we're going to get rid of the Constitution, we're going to get rid of the National Charter, because God and the Prophet said so. And Belhaj, who was the number 2 in the Islamic Salvation Front, was openly saying, we have the law of God, we don't need the law of man, and we're going to kill all of these unbelievers. So whether you agree with the interruption or you don't agree with the interruption of the process, that is a little bit different than the way that it is very often characterized. And as terrible as things turned out afterwards, and they did, and I don't have time to say much about that now, many people believe that it would have been worse if the fundamentalists had been allowed to dismantle the republic from the inside. And one intellectual said to me, we would have become Afghanistan. And I think one of the critical things that we need to learn from Algeria that is helpful in understanding the situation in North Africa now and the way in which the international community has misunderstood it since 2011 is that democracy is not just about a process called elections, right? Insta-democracy. It's also about the substance. It's whether or not you actually believe in the equality of the people in the polity or not. And I think, this is not to say you can play fast and loose with the process either. I'm not going in that direction, but I think we have to have a holistic view of this. And women's human rights defenders understand this very clearly. And the suggestion was made that, both sides killed in Algeria in the 90s. Well, actually what happened was this, and this is from the words of the Coalition of the Associations of Victims of the 1990s. This is coalitions of victims of both sides. What they said is, in the 90s, our country experienced a bloody war fought by the Islamist armed groups against society, which caused hundreds of thousands of victims. Unarmed citizens who were not protected by the state were the principal targets of assassinations, torture, disappearances, mass rapes, and massacres by the armed groups. In its fight against terrorism, the state also engaged in massive and indiscriminate repression, including arbitrary arrests, extrajudicial executions, torture, and forced disappearances. 8,000 people disappeared after being arrested by state forces. No investigations have ever been carried out to determine the fate of these disappeared persons or those who were kidnapped by the Islamist armed groups. So again, this universal, multi-directional quest for accountability. But we have to be very clear what happened in Algeria was much like with Islamic State to some degree in the Iraqi context, much more than in Syria. But the point was that it was a war against the civilian population by the fundamentalist armed groups in accordance with their ideology. It didn't happen by accident. As the feminists, if you look at some of the interesting feminist writing from Algeria in that time, as they said, this violence is neither a reflection of collective insanity nor of the perversity or the sadism of particular individuals. It is the consequence of a political project in which all practices are based on juridico-religious justifications. So if you want to take on this violence, you have to take on the ideology. You have to go after and challenge those who manufacture these juridico-religious justifications. And this is what Sharifa Kedar told me as well. And she lost her brother and her sister to the armed Islamic group back in the 90s. She said, look, if you actually want to defeat this terrorism, you have to take on the fundamentalist ideology that underlies it. But one absolutely critical thing here is that, and I heard this from Sharifa, who works very closely with some of the associations of victims of the state, what we need is an effective struggle against fundamentalism, which also itself respects human rights. And there are massive violations going on, of course, also justified in the name of fighting extremism. I had to fight with my editor to keep in the last chapter of my book, which is precisely about that. And that actually greatly discredits the struggle of those who are fighting against fundamentalism. And again, it is about having to challenge multi-directionally. And there's much more that I would like to say about that, but I am going to really move on. So what do we do now? Well, that I think is the very big question. I heard different things about this from different people. I interviewed a Libyan woman recently, Ala Murabit, who said we need greater emphasis on institution building, promotion of fair governance, greater economic opportunities, formal and informal education, health, and building the skills and resource access of local community leaders. I read recently a very interesting article by Hind Meddeb, who's the daughter of the late Abdul Wahab Meddeb, who wrote about this, wrote a very interesting interesting book called The Malady of Islam back in 2003 about all of this. And he really, I think, foresaw some of the dangers. And Hind wrote after the Sousse attacks that we need a Marshall Plan to save Tunisia. I think a Marshall Plan might be helpful really for much of the region at this point in terms of real economic support and support for development and promoting opportunities for young people and so on. But Hind Meddeb also said we need a clear rejection of political Islam in all its forms. And she saw these things as going together. The Marshall Plan, the rejection of political Islam, and she saw these, as she said, the only solution and the only prospect. Now, let me just close by saying there is a lot to be very worried about and very concerned about. And I think the situation in North Africa at the moment could get much, much worse before it gets better. I think about an email that I received recently from Algeria from somebody saying we're looking around at the regional developments and we really are worried about this globalization of terror that may come back to us here. If you look at what's happening in Libya, if you look at the potential for the security situation to get much worse potentially in Tunisia as well. But there is still optimism on the ground. And I think that optimism is something that we have to promote and listen to, and we can't give in to political depression ourselves. I think in this season, beyond the season called spring, it is going to take an unflinching and multi-directional fight against autocracy and fundamentalism, a rigorous commitment to all kinds of equality, and a very reliable political and moral compass to find what the Algerian writer Mustafa Ben Fodil dubbed the imaginary and poetic republics of North Africa, and to keep them. But somewhere they do exist. Thank you very much.